All right. What I want to look at now is how exactly Locke is going to respond to the Euthyphro dilemma. And this problem gets raised, if you'll recall, the Euthyphro dilemma does, against any view according to which God's commands are central to morality. And Locke's given us such a view, right? If you have morality, that implies there's some sort of law. In order for an action to be moral or immoral, there's got to be some law that it either conforms to or violates. And that law, according to Locke, is given by God. And he calls it the divine law or the law of nature. Um, and God is the one who punishes those who break it and rewards those who follow it and so on. And so, okay, God's commands that is what morality is. Morality is simply the commands of God for how we ought to behave, for how we should behave and so on. Okay, how exactly would Locke handle the Euthyphro dilemma? What exactly would he say? So what I want to do is remind you of what it is. So there's the Euthyphro dilemma as we saw it when we were going over Aquinas. So the Euthyphro dilemma says, this will be very quick, you think God's commands are important for morality. Well, how exactly are they related to morality? Do his commands make things immoral in the first place? That would be option B. Or do his commands kind of follow the standards of morality? And he's passing along to us what morality requires of us. That would be option A, right? Does God tell us not to murder because murder is wrong and God can see that and so letting us know? Option A. Or is God telling us not to murder what makes murder wrong? Option B. The dilemma is that either way you go looks unappealing for the person who thinks God's commands are important for morality. Because if you go with option A, well, then you're turning God into a mere middleman. God is merely passing information along about what is moral or immoral, right? And as with any middleman, you might think, well, let's just get rid of the middleman. Why don't we just consult the source of morality ourselves, which isn't God, right? It's something else. Let's just do that, right? God's just a middleman telling us what's right and wrong. And so God is inessential for morality, really. Well, fine. Then if you go option B, because option A is kind of unappealing for somebody who thinks God's commands are important for morality, well, option B then, how does that one work? Maybe that'll work. Well, the problem there is that it turns God into a kind of tyrant with these arbitrary commands, right? God just so happened to tell us not to murder. And so it just so happens to be the case that we ought not murder. But God could have told us anything. God could have come and told us, steal everyone's stuff or whatever, punch the person to the left, murder the person to the right. He could have told us anything. And then all of a sudden, that would be what morality requires. That's crazy. Morality isn't arbitrary like that. God couldn't just tell us, or God's commands, because God could just tell us anything. Those commands can't really be what morality consists in. If God's commands made things morally wrong, well, God could make anything morally wrong and could make anything morally right. That's impossible. Try as you like, God cannot make it morally right to murder people, right? That would be the problem, arguably, that option B runs into. What I want to do very quickly is remind you of Aquinas' solution. So Aquinas never explicitly discusses the Euthyphro dilemma, but other people following in Aquinas' footsteps have, and they've tried to respond to the Euthyphro dilemma in this way, right? In the way that we discussed when we were looking at Aquinas. Now, I don't want to go over his response in any kind of detail. You can go back and look at the video on Aquinas if you'd like to see that. What I'd like to highlight right now for you, and I highlighted this back in the video in Aquinas, is the fact that human nature is central to how Aquinas responds to the Euthyphro dilemma. Human nature is the hinge upon which his response turns. And human nature is really the kind of Aristotelian influence on Aquinas, right? Aquinas is getting his ideas about human nature and how human nature is related to morality and ethics from Aristotle, right? It's because our nature is in a particular way. It's because we have a particular kind of nature that we ought to behave in a particular kind of way, right? It's because we have these natural inclinations that we ought to do X, Y, and Z. Or to put it in Aristotelian vein, it's because we have this function, the rational activity, that we ought to act in such and such a way, right? And so human nature is crucial to Aquinas's view, to his response to the Euthyphro dilemma. And Aquinas, as we've seen, gives us, I don't know if you find it convincing, but a fairly sophisticated, call it that at the very least, response to the Euthyphro dilemma. Well, so how is Locke going to respond? This is going to be particularly pressing for Locke because he cannot respond in the same way as Aquinas did. Why not? Because Locke has thrown aside all of that stuff about function, nature, and happiness. He gives a different account of happiness and a different account of the good. Why? Because he's rejected this teleological view of the world. Another way of understanding or another way of describing Aquinas's response to the Euthyphro dilemma is to say that it hinges on this teleological conception of human beings, right? It hinges on human nature. It hinges on this teleological conception of human beings, that human beings have a certain purpose or function. These are the natural inclinations. And for a human being to live well, they need to act on those functions or inclinations or whatever it might be. They need to perfect their nature. That's what their happiness consists in. And so that's why God gives the commands that God does. Locke can't say hardly any of that because he's thrown aside this idea that human beings have a function or a nature, the perfection of which is what our happiness consists in. Locke's thrown that aside. That's part of a pre-scientific or unscientific, Locke would say, way of looking at the world, a teleological conception of the world. Well, okay then, so what is Locke going to say? He can't respond to the Euthyphro dilemma in the same way. How is he going to respond? Well, recall what we were just looking at. That guy who is thinking about why you ought to obey the law. Why ought you to obey the divine law according to Locke? His answer to that question seems to indicate how he would respond to the Euthyphro dilemma. What he says, what Locke says, is that, well, look, if you have the idea of God and you have the idea of yourself, God made you, God is superior, you were made by God, you're inferior to God, you can just see, it's just self-evident that you ought to obey God, and that if God gives you commands, you ought to obey them. The divine law, those are just God's commands, and so you ought to obey it, right? Because God's superior and created you, you were made by God, you're inferior to God, and so you ought to obey God's commands. That's Locke's argument for why we should obey the divine law. That seems to offer some insight into how Locke would respond to the Euthyphro dilemma. Because what that suggests, what that argument as to why we should obey the divine law suggests, is that Locke would just accept B. Locke would just say, yeah, things are wrong because God said so, and you got to listen to God, right? Murder is wrong because God forbade it. God forbade it. And so, yeah, don't murder. And if God came down tomorrow and said, yeah, murder all the, all the people over 6'4", take them out. Well, God's superior. God made you. You got to listen to him. And so if that's what he says, well, that's what you got to do now. You got to go murder all the people over 6'4", right? That's the view that Locke very strongly suggests. Now, it should be said, this uh, well, how to put this? So this view, if you just accept B, well, then you run into this problem. Morality is arbitrary, or, and you just have this kind of tyrant God who willy-nilly gives you commands, and you got to listen to him now. And if it's to go murder people over 6'4", well, you got to go listen to it. That doesn't seem particularly like a particularly appealing account of morality, right? And so a lot of people have found accepting B to be unpalatable. And it seems from various correspondence that we have from Locke that he found it kind of unpalatable as well. People had raised this issue for Locke's views during Locke's own lifetime. Hey, Locke, your view seems to imply that, God's commands, like that's all there is to it. It seems to imply what people would later come to call theological voluntarism, or same thing, divine command theory. Your view, Locke, seems to be a divine command theory. If you accept horn B, path B of the Euthyphro dilemma, if you just say, yes, murder is morally wrong because God forbids it, that's why it's wrong. And if God didn't forbid it, it wouldn't be wrong. That position is called theological voluntarism or divine command theory. And so Locke seems to be a divine command theorist or a theological voluntarist. Same thing. Those are just two words for the same exact thing. Those are synonyms. And people brought this up to Locke during his life. Locke did seem to find it unpalatable, but never really offered any kind of response. Never really said, no, I'm not, because blah, blah, blah. There was never a blah, blah, blah. And so Locke's view seems committed to theological voluntarism. Locke's, right? You follow the law because God gave it to you, end of story. And if you don't, you're going to hell, right? And so you kind of have this God who's giving commands somewhat arbitrarily. He's not giving the commands because they're good or they're right? That would put you in horn A. No, he's just giving the commands just because he's given the commands, whatever they happen to be. And if you don't follow him, you go to hell. A lot of people have found this view kind of unpalatable. But Locke seems to be committed to it. And he's committed to it. He's committed to theological voluntarism, divine command theory in particular, in part at least because of the rejection of teleology, right? The rejection of teleology doesn't allow Locke to give any more sophisticated a response to the Euthyphro dilemma. Locke is kind of stuck giving this kind of response, just accepting B and not really being able to say anything about it, right? And so we're kind of seeing what's left after teleology has been discredited and rejected. What's left of our ethical system? It's left certain kind of wreckage in its wake, right? There are certain holes that need patching up. And Locke's trying to do the best he can, but it's not clear how well it really comes together.